All right, Jay. So the field of neurofeedback, it's gaining a lot of momentum down in South America, and there's a wide interest in optimizing brain functioning through technology. What are your impressions on what neurofeedback has accomplished in the last 5-10 years, and where do you think it's going to take us in the future?
The field of neurofeedback has been around for a long time. Historically, they have not done the appropriate high level of science to validate their techniques. And as you say, the progress in the last decade or so has been tremendous. As the technique has been adopted internationally, major academic institutions in Europe and elsewhere have taken up the technique and done the validation studies that the clinicians in the US probably should have been doing 20, 30 years ago. Luckily, the validation studies have been of sufficient quality that we've been able to do meta-analysis of the research to prove the efficacy of neurofeedback in different application areas, including very serious areas like epilepsy, where the seizures are uncontrollable with medication, but also in areas that are less medical, severe problems like epilepsy, like ADD-ADHD. The ADD-ADHD studies actually have shown in their literature to have a larger effect size than the medication literature. So the neurofeedback is proving itself to the point that recently the American Academy of Pediatrics approved it as a level 1 treatment for ADD-ADHD. And the FDA has now approved the theta-beta ratio, which we're using in 1999 as a diagnostic instrument. Now, unfortunately for the FDA, we've gone far beyond that at this point, so they have a little ways to catch up. But at least they're recognizing that the brain is an area that you need to look for these attentional deficits. I think one of the more powerful things about neurofeedback is that it puts the locus of control in the right location. The individual is responsible for their own recovery or circumstance. And with this training technique, individuals can gain control over their brain in a way that allows them to optimize its function. It's not just good for pathology like ADD-ADHD or epilepsy, it's also good for other pathologies, but we don't have the solid literature there yet. Autism, depression, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, these are emerging applications where the level of science isn't there to prove the application. The clinical experience points to this as being a fruitful area for research, however, in that we expect, based on our experience, to have positive research outcomes. There's also the area of peak performance. If you optimize your brain function, this is also good for athletes, this is also good for businessmen, this is also good for students. You don't have to be broken to be optimized. Everybody could stand a little improvement somewhere. And this is a driver's training course to learn how to control your brain. And we don't have very many opportunities to get that. Neurofeedback provides this unique opportunity to gain control volitionally of your own brain function. We've seen intractable epileptics with seizure history for 4 years, 8-year-old girl, unable to even speak or tie her shoes. Within 42 training sessions is riding a bike and speaking fluently. Dramatic change in the trajectory of her life. Instead of being a ward of the state, somebody who's totally dependent, she's now a young girl developing in a normal trajectory. So you can turn around lives in a major way. It also can facilitate recovery after traumatic brain injury. And although this application is still another emerging application, our experience with it also shows that this should end up being a very positive area for research. We also have areas like addiction, and addiction is a big problem worldwide. It's not just in the United States, although the U.S. obviously has a big problem. We import drugs from all over the world in order to supply the desire here locally. In our work with addiction, the standard treatment programs of counseling, individual and group therapy, and so forth, we augmented that with neurofeedback, and we found 100% of the individuals at 1 year follow-up had still remained abstinent. Now, if all they were is clean and sober, everyone would consider this a success. But we also looked at their neurocognitive functioning. We found a 21-point jump in their IQ, standard score. They went from a normal adult to a superior adult. Dramatic improvements across the board. All the neurocognitive measures improved. It may seem almost like an excessive expectation, but when you make the brain work better, it works better. And the common sense of that seems to have escaped a lot of people. But when you optimize brain function, it's not just the thing you treated that's improved. The entire brain function and life is improved. So neurofeedback is one of the neuromodulatory techniques. It's been around for a long time now. I've been in this field 41 years, and I wasn't a founder of the field. In the United States, the reputation of neurofeedback back in the 60s and 70s was a little bit sullied because it was viewed by traditional medical people as a bunch of hippies doing meditation and consciousness things. But the field basically had to kind of die and be reborn. And in the 1970s, the government quit funding research in the area. Pretty much all the people who were financially interested in the field disappeared. There were only a handful of researchers in the field. Based on the few scientific folks that were still there, reformed itself with Lubar and Sturman's work, and eventually the clinical work of the other clinical groups coming in, the Othmers and other devices, Len Oaks' device, more recently magnetic stimulation devices and so forth. So the neuromodulation field, although it's been here a long time, within the United States, we never got rid of our first impression. But worldwide, they didn't have the first impression then. They have the first impression now. And if you look at the field now, it's not a bunch of hippies. It's actually a really respected scientific literature and major laboratories worldwide doing research in this area. So the field has changed as it's become more international and more scientific. It's gained more acceptance. At this point, the level of science is sufficient so that this field has a solid scientific base, and we have world-class, famous neuroscientists doing neurofeedback without worrying about their reputation. Now, I have to apologize. I was one of the hippies in the early days of the field that probably ruined the reputation of the field, but I'm still here anyway. So my apologies to anyone who was offended by my long hair and silliness in the early days. But I think the field has recovered from me very nicely over the years. They still let me in, but the field has matured beautifully. Our literature is solid. Our studies are being published in high-impact journals, not just the Journal of Neurotherapy. They're in world-class journals. The application of neurofeedback to sleep insomnia problems was only proven in 2008 in research in Salzburg, Austria. In the United States, everybody has been treating insomnia knowing that it works, neurofeedback works, based on animal studies. You can't really use that as an efficacy literature. SMR training made better sleep spindles in cats. Well, I can't call that support for me treating people. Luckily, more recently, not just the clinical work in the US, but the European academics have now done validation studies. So what we claim we can treat now is actually provable. And when I was president of the International Society in 2001, we created a hierarchy of efficacy, a gradation of what kind of research literature you had to have to make what kind of claim. And you can be an experimental application with anecdotal support, but it's still experimental. You can point to successful cases, but you can't really claim full efficacy. The next level up is possibly efficacious. Well, there you need a little bit more than just an anecdote, but it's not really a well-constructed study. The preponderance of case series, a little bit of randomization, and you can claim that. At the next level up, it's probably efficacious. Then fully efficacious, you need randomization and control groups. Placebo control if possible. Not everything can be done with placebo. It's not ethical in all applications. If you have a known therapy, you can't give a placebo. You can compare your new treatment to the old therapy, but you can't give a placebo. So in the circumstances where it's possible, you need to. And then finally, specific. If you're the baddest horse in the race, you're the winner. You've been tested against other therapies, and you're the best. You can claim specificity. For ADD/ADHD, the effect size in the literature is larger than the effect size in the literature for medication. So the meta-analysis published recently by Dr. Arns in the Netherlands, Martijn Arns, actually concluded that not only was neurofeedback for ADD/ADHD effective, but it was also specific, having a larger effect size than other known treatments. So our field has come a long ways from a bunch of hippies doing goodness knows what alpha treatments were done early on in the field, claiming almost everything with no real support, to being able to make solid claims based on published neuroscience in high-impact journals. Our ability to claim treatment of insomnia is published in the journal Sleep, not in the journal of Neurotherapy. So our publications are actually in the appropriate journals for the area that it's being worked on in. The technology has progressed tremendously. The early days were not the good old days, the bad old days. We had gigantic amplifiers that were hugely expensive. The size of a desk, $165,000 for an EEG machine. Now you can buy them for $5,000, $10,000, the size of a small book. I almost consider them disposable, they're so cheap now. But tremendous advances technologically. We have the ability to do an inverse solution from the surface EEG. Where did it come from deep in the brain? Those technologies didn't exist 40 years ago. The ability to use databases to identify areas that are deviant within the brain, to identify patterns of deviation that are consistent with different disorders. So we've matured over time. We've cut the long hair. And now as a field, we're quite acceptable. If you look in Europe, there's no pejorative against being involved in neurofeedback. You don't ruin your reputation. You don't get thrown out of grad school. It's a perfectly acceptable, valid tool. And this is a good change. I'm happy to see the solid scientific base for the field. We're not standing on marsh, on soft ground. This is not quicksand. We're not sinking. We're on a solid scientific base. And building on that, we have a tremendous future.